Welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my office at Behringer-Crawford Museum. Also joining me as our presenter for this evening, Micah Lynn, and my assistant for this evening, BCM Visitor Services Associate Heather Cook. Thank you both for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and our members. If you are not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. You can learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. Now let's meet tonight's presenter. Micah Lynn is a master's student in history at the University of Kentucky. He is co-founder of the Woodford County Remembrance Coalition in his hometown, where he works with his community to reflect on the county's complex and challenging history. Now, before we get started, we would love to hear from our viewers tonight. So if you have a question or a comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Now the fun part with our quiz question. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. Tonight's question is this. This formerly majority Black town once had the highest proportion of African American residents in Kentucky. And we want you to name that town. So you can go ahead and get those answers in the chat. And we're going to stop sharing our screen. And Micah, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we can go ahead and get started.
All right, sounds great. Let me share my screen here. Oh, that's the wrong button. Well, all right. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate being welcome here. It is an honor to be presenting on this today. Before we start, I want to kind of give a brief outline of the geographic and temporal bounds of this presentation here. Black armed response to white racial violence in central Kentucky. I'm focusing today on the Reconstruction era, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with elements of the Reconstruction era when former Confederate states were split up into different military districts and not re-allowed back into the Union until they ratified the 13th and 14th Amendments, finally making Black people citizens. In Kentucky, the process was a little bit different. And when we talk about the Reconstruction era in Kentucky, yes, it is important to note that there was a degree of federal intervention in Kentucky. There was military stationed in the area. However, if you look at the white Democratic press in Kentucky, you can often find boasting about the fact that Kentucky was not reconstructed like the rest of the South's Republican governments, and that Black rights had not proceeded to the same level as the rest of the South. And so while there were troops stationed in Kentucky and the Freedmen's Bureau, which was formed to help transition freed people into emancipation, was present in Kentucky, this level of Reconstruction was not the same as there was in the former Confederate states. And that's important to remember when we talk about Reconstruction era in Kentucky, because the same provisions that we see in, for instance, the Black Codes, which spread all around the former Confederate states, essentially trying to reduce Black people back to a state of slavery in former Confederate states. A lot of these provisions were present in Kentucky, where Black minors could be apprenticed back to their former masters, or where owning firearms was illegal for Black people. And while these provisions went away in the former Confederate states after they were divided up into military districts and reconstructed by the radical Republican legislature in Kentucky, some of these distinctions remained. And some scholars have gone as far to say that Kentucky was a site of a quote unquote rehearsal for redemption, In other words, it was a sort of staging ground for the overturning of Reconstruction in the rest of the South. And today we're also going to be focusing on specifically central Kentucky during this time period, because central Kentucky was the focus of the state's uh, political power in the antebellum era, and it was the focus of Kentucky's slave system, where specifically hemp, but also tobacco was grown. And you can see here the centralization of the Black population in these bluegrass counties. This is a map here that I have made. And this central Kentucky is also where most of the racial violence was centralized during this era, as we will see. So we're going to start out with Black troops in the Civil War and the Civil War in Kentucky. It's important to remember that Kentucky eventually joined the Union after Confederates invaded in the Jackson Purchase. But the unionism in Kentucky was a tepid sort of unionism. Most of Kentucky's unionists were conservative unionists who supported the Union for their own self-interests. They were slave owners, hoping that staying in the Union would help the status of slavery. And early on in the war, Lincoln indeed treated Kentucky and the rest of the border states with a very light hand. And we will see that as the tide starts to turn in the Civil War, these conservative Unionists are going to be quite outraged by the position of the state's freed people and slaves who are becoming freed people as they join the Union Army, enlisting in the army and gaining their freedom. To them, this stood against the very idea of what unionism was in their minds. But the Black troops in the Civil War in Kentucky were great. A majority of the unions of Kentucky's Union soldiers by 1865 were Black, for instance, and a majority of the state's men of age, Black men of age, joined the Union Army in that time period. And they created a a essentially a clash between the conservative white forces and Black forces trying to establish their own citizenship. So we see a white counter-revolution that I will also go over with paramilitary groups such as the Regulators and later the Ku Klux Klan. So we will cover that, the response to the Regulators in the late 1860s, the response to the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, and then finally the response to the Klan. And with all of these, I will be returning to three significant themes that will kind of ground this discussion. First of all, political consciousness. I'm aiming to show that Black resistance in this time period involved a political consciousness. Black people were prepared to politically organize. They wanted access to the polls. They were joining Republican fraternal societies, the most notorious of them being the semi-secret fraternal society, the Union League. And this political consciousness is very important to discuss in terms of Reconstruction. Martial manhood is the next thing that I want to highlight. Essentially, as Black people fought for their citizenship, they did it within a framework that was familiar with former democratic revolutions, meaning that in order to exercise yourself as a citizen and to gain rights, public rights and rights to vote, you had to demonstrate a sort of self-ownership. It was a very gendered form of citizenship that we're talking about in this time period. And Black men tried to wield this former already existing image of citizenship, wielding that in order to make the best play for their own citizenship. So often we see these um, highly ideological displays of martial manhood, in which, for instance, the defending of one's own domain, the household was incredibly important, not just for obvious practical reasons, but for ideological reasons. White folks would attack Black households with an ideological reason as well, as a sort of assault on Black people's manhood. You will also see this in public spaces with military drills being very frequent in the time period, and at polls where clashes were very common. And this was seen as a manifestation of the need to demonstrate martial manhood while trying to claim these rights. Finally, I want to highlight the community aspect of the resistance during this time. All individual acts of resistance. I want to kind of shun individually minded analysis of these acts of resistance and show the deep roots in the community that lead to these acts and beyond the iceberg of martial manhood. Because in order to do a lot of these acts of armed resistance, it requires the community care of Black women and the support of the wider community. And along with that, I do want to highlight that Black veterans often made a sort of vanguard, uh, politically organizing these acts of resistance in a lot of aspects and taking on military tactics that they had learned during their experience in the Union Army. So, starting out with Black troops in the Civil War, we see that over 80% of Black soldiers in the Bluegrass were Black in 1865. Of course, because Kentucky was not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people in Kentucky were not freed by this proclamation, and slavery in Kentucky lasted much longer. There was a higher motivation to join the Union Army in order to gain access to freedom that was being offered in exchange for service. So in 1864, uh, enslaved people in Kentucky could enlist as soldiers, and right off the bat, there was a flood of people enlisting. Later, a law will be passed that allows one man's status in the military to free the rest of their family members. And we will see that 70% of the state's enslaved people freed themselves either through enlistment or a family member's military affiliation. Since we've already covered the conservative unionism in Kentucky, it's easy to see how this would have brought tempers to start boiling. Um, White Kentuckians were particularly dismayed when they saw the sort of meaning of their unionist side in the Civil War changed and morphed into one which stood for the emancipation of slavery, which stood for Black people gaining their rights. And this was very much because of the initiative of Black people in this time. In response, white Kentuckians, including many white Unionists, and immediately started targeting enslaved people who went to volunteer for the army. For instance, there was a killing spree in Nelson County where 8 different Black people were killed on their way to register. In Marion County, 2 Black people on their way to register were stopped by someone acting in the role of a slave patrolman who cut off both of their ears. Bodily mutilation was authorized in people acting in the slave patrol already, and we can see with the line between the slave system, and the end of the slave system, how these things started to clash. Finally, a group of around 250 Black people going to enlist at Camp Nelson, which was the largest enlistment center for Black soldiers in Kentucky, were met with a mob of white people who started throwing stones at them before opening fire. So immediately we can see this counter-revolution breaking out. We can see white violence being enacted against Black people. Another way that this was formed was in seizing guns from Black veterans as they muster out. This was done through legal matters because Kentucky had laws against Black people owning firearms. And it was also done through illegal maneuvers of terrorists on raids, breaking into houses and taking arms. The formation of the regulators would intensify this white counter-revolution. In the 1860s, the groups of terrorists primarily operating around the southern rim of the Bluegrass region were known as regulators, operating in Garrett, Lincoln, Mercer, Boyle counties. And they were composed of smaller bands. For instance, in Lincoln County, you had the Crab Orchard Gang that would coordinate themselves by the blasts of steam whistles from sawmills. They would use hand cars to get around, and they would retreat into the surrounding knobs after their attacks. Then the white press shifts into talking about the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s and at the very end of the 1860s. And they operate out of their strongholds in Franklin, Henry, Owen, Scott, and Shelby counties. So first, I want to start out with the responses to the regulators. And I think the most important place to start out is in Camp Nelson in Jessamine County because of its status as the largest place of enlistment for Black soldiers. It was targeted during the war. Um, also during the war, Black soldiers enlisting at Camp Nelson immediately started advocating for the ability of their family to settle along with them in the area. And eventually, they won the ability to have refugees, their families, settle in a nearby refugee camp. And after Camp Nelson is disbanded, we will see that this refugee camp blossoms into its own Black hamlet known as Ariel. And Ariel is immediately attacked by regulators. In 1866, because the military was not answering their calls for help, no troops were coming down to put down the regulator threat, Ariel residents formed their own armed pickets to guard the town. With the promise of troops coming, they disbanded, but the troops were not forthcoming, and having disbanded, they were attacked. The regulators started out, like they often did, by breaking into homes to steal guns and disarm the local population. Later, another attack came that tried to target the schoolhouse in the neighborhood. A man named John Burnside, a veteran who was stationed at Camp Nelson, made a brave defense against this attacking band of regulators, and a white missionary there stationed there bravely said that, or proudly said that he had stood up and bravely defended himself and his family like a tiger. But the attacks renewed every time the pickets were disbanded. Military intervention was delayed and weak. Eventually, the white missionaries staying in Ariel were smuggled out for their own protection by Black women in the area. These attacks continued into 1868, but we can see that Ariel residents were very politically minded. They organized their own branch of the semi-secret organization known as the Union League, which was often connected to paramilitary activity such as drilling in order to prepare for self-defense. Regulators attacked this meeting and whipped the leaders. Another crucial example of regulator violence comes in Lincoln County, where in 1867, freed people circulated a petition for the right to vote. The regulators responded by raiding a community in the north of the county, capturing and torturing one man, and interrogating them to ask if he was a veteran. They were particularly concerned with capturing veterans. For instance, in their attacks, they were quoted as saying that they were looking for a GD soldier inward. In 1868, these targeted attacks continued, but in this incident, an attack on a cabin of Black veterans was met with open fire on the attackers, killing 3 of the regulators. So we can see that even though the regulators had the upper hand in the extent of how they were armed and in their virtual political immunity, that you would rarely see a regulator up for trial. Attacking the Black community was not always an easy task, and veterans were particularly prepared to respond. Around this time period in 1868, we see the white press start talking about the Klan more often than the regulators. The distinction between these two paramilitary groups is pretty nebulous. And here you can see a newspaper article listing all of the different outrages from the regulators. But the regulators and the Klan in Kentucky in this time period were not really truly distinct groups as much as just nebulous bands of vigilantes that we don't know too much about. And around 1868, as the Ku Klux Klan that we know of, led by Nathaniel Bedford Forrest in Tennessee, emerged into the public eye even more. In Kentucky, the Klan was talked about more. So there is a change in how white vigilantes are discussed in the press. But what's most meaningful to remember is that the epicenter of the violence starts to shift from that southern rim of the bluegrass up into the northwest reaches of the bluegrass. There were many Southerners who denied that the Klan existed at all, and many Kentuckians proclaimed that there was no Klan in the state, often saying it was just a bunch of pranksters or jokesters, and that the Republicans were making a mountain out of a molehill and being hyper partisan. Often Republicans would respond by printing the Klan notices that were already being circulated and demonstrating the existence in the state. One example that we can see after this shift into talking about the Klan of Black resistance comes in the suburbs of Paris. It's important to mention that Black outmigration from the surrounding countryside and into towns like Paris, and especially cities such as Covington, Louisville, and Lexington, was really intense at this time period, and safety was to be found in numbers. One of the Black suburbs in Paris was Claysville, and here in Claysville in 1868, Black residents responded to threats of violence from the Ku Klux Klan by forming an armed patrol. The white press in the area responded in absolute panic. One of the incidents that they recalled involved a white man entering Claysville, trying to find a Black man who he had working for him. And when he tried to enter the neighborhood, a roadblock was set up, and a Black man with a gun uh, confronted him, asked him to state his business, pointed the gun at his chest, told him to stop giving him lip, essentially. And this caused great alarm among the white community in Paris and throughout the state, no doubt being reminded of what they saw as the humiliations of the Civil War, during which many Black Union soldiers had occupied bluegrass towns. Positive coverage of this drilling in Claysville came from Republican newspapers, leading to backlash from Democratic ones. In fact, the Democratic papers would claim that there was no Klan in Paris whatsoever, that all that existed was a group of white men who were coincidentally concerned with ending the specter of miscegenation in the community. And so we can see that the white Democrats in this time period had very flimsy defenses, uh, but they continued to deny the problem at all. And this is from the Democratic paper, the Paris True Kentuckian, recalling how within the last few days, Black people in the area formed, quote, a regular military organization among themselves, armed, equipped, officered, with their headquarters in the schoolhouse. The way that they treated this was as if it was a military organization. So we can see the paramilitary character of this sort of drilling, these actions of cordoning off a neighborhood in self-defense. Obviously, it's likely that the white Democrats were exaggerating the exact military nature of this. But what is clear is that there was a definite organization. This was an organized action. It was not haphazard. So here are some takeaways from these acts of resistance before the 15th Amendment. First of all, we can already see this burgeoning political consciousness. African Americans were prepared to organize among themselves, joining the Loyal League, and even passing around petitions to vote despite the very obvious risks that they faced. In terms of martial manhood, we can see how, on one hand, white people attacked Black manhood by attacking women and children in places like Ariel. John Burnside, in his stand in Ariel, was applauded for having defended the women and children. He was applauded for his masculine behavior. And essentially, we can see that the idea of defending one's household was crucial to the ideas of martial manhood. When Republican newspapers defended the actions of Black self-defense, they often portrayed this defense of the household as a very crucial thing. In addition to that, the need for being armed was also crucial, and white men at this time recognized how crucial it was to disarm Black men at the same time as they armed themselves. So we saw the different raids. There were also legal tactics. For instance, there was one instance of trickery within which a white man would go offer to buy a gun off of a Black man for some absurdly low price. And when that Black man refused, he would turn him into the authorities. And then all of a sudden, the gun from that Black man was now in the white man's possession. So you have different tactics like this in order to disarm Black people and to sort of take away that sense of manhood that comes from this martial ability and the martial experience from military service. Finally, we have collective resistance and military tactics. We see in the case of John Burnside individual tactics, but the resistance goes much beyond that. Specifically in Claysville and in the drilling and Ariel, we can see the collective organized nature and the proactive nature of the resistance with drilling, picketing, and cordoning that took on a paramilitary character, which was probably influenced by the military experience of the majority of the state's Black men. So next we move on to post-15th Amendment. Black people in Kentucky could not vote under any circumstances before the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, and this opened up suffrage to Black men specifically. And we see a spate of election violence in Kentucky after this amendment is passed. In Harrodsburg, for instance, 4 die and over 500 shots are fired. In Paris, Lexington, and Frankfort, we also see grave consequences. So let's turn to Harrodsburg first. Here you can see circled the area around the courthouse in Harrodsburg. To the right is Main Street, where a fight broke out in the line to vote, and fighting spread all along Main Street. The Democrats stormed the polls. They beat the Republican candidate for county clerk with a baseball bat, and it was an all-out brawl that resulted in at least 4 people, 4 Black people specifically, dying. But in the course of this riot, Black people were prepared for this incidence of violence, and they called out for reinforcements with the sound of drums. And we see reports that hundreds of armed Black people responded and collected around the courthouse and fought back. In Frankfort, we find another incident of election violence. Actually, 2 incidents, one in January and then a fatal, more consequential one in August. Men were waiting in line to vote around the old train station and marketplace, circled in yellow here. And reports say that a train passed through on Broadway Street before the 2 sides, Black people gathered on the north and white people on the south, started throwing rocks and bricks at each other before it broke out into shooting. And 2 white people were killed in the melee. Some white residents discussed the possibility of running out the Black population as a result. But what they eventually did was arrest a Black Republican political leader, Henry Washington, who was wounded in the fray. And that night, a mob abducted him from the jail, circled here, and took him across to South Frankfort with another inmate, Harry Johnson, where they hanged both of them around the site of 2nd Street Elementary today. Black people were not allowed to testify in courts in Kentucky at this time. This is another example of how Kentucky was not reconstructed to the same level of other southern states. But the federal government ended up intervening in this case in order to try those accused of being in the mob. those who were accused of lynching him, the two, Harry Johnson and Henry Washington, were some of the most prominent men in Frankfurt. One of them, for instance, was a Crittenden. And in order to protect the lynch mob, Kentucky conceded black testimony in state courts, which allowed them to take up the case of this trial and then instantly drop it, letting the men in the lynch mob go free. Moving on, in Lexington and Paris, we also see Black people responding to election violence by calling for reinforcement, and we see an immediate surge of resistance, of people coming in with guns prepared to fight back. But in all of these instances, Black self-defense, the call for these reinforcements, was seen by white men as a particularly horrific thing. And the Republican papers even reported in dismay just how unfair it was that while white Democrats had a right to wear their arms, whenever a Black person had guns in order to defend their lives, it was a cause for their indiscriminate massacre. But importantly, we can see in all of these events that the Black armed response demonstrated an organization that showed the necessity of an armed response in order to back up Black emancipatory politics. And we can see a martial tradition that's furthered in the use of drums. Obviously, during the war, you would have drums and fife. The drums also demonstrated the complex communication networks. Drums were a means of communication, too. These incidents remind me of a incident that came before all of these in Danville. At the very end of the war in 1865, soldiers in Danville responded in a similar way to an incident at the Boyle County Fair. It was the first time that Black people could legally assemble for the fair without white supervision. A segregated pen was established, which Black fairgoers left. And as a result, white fairgoers opened fire. And like in a lot of these cases, we see that immediately after white people open fire, Black people are responding with reinforcements. Black soldiers, in this case, who were stopped by officers from intervening. But really, what we see is that Black soldiers and Black veterans are the vanguard in these responses. They had military experience. They had experience commanding and being organized in these sorts of responses. And that continues. And it becomes even more radical and more common after the 15th Amendment. Now we will go to Versailles in Woodford County, which was at the time the blackest city in the Bluegrass, where we can see another example of an armed demonstration and a martial response. Versailles was no stranger to martial responses to white violence. In 1868, a couple of Lawrenceburg men, self-identifying as Ku Klux, went marauding down Versailles Road from a Black hamlet called Slickaway that's a little bit to the west of the Lexington airport. They went down this road, whipping Black men and women. And near Versailles, a Black woman they whipped reported this to local white men, who gathered on an armed force on horseback and shot at the house where the Ku Kluxers were staying. So it shouldn't be surprised that we'll see another incident of a martial response to white violence in 1870. Around election time, a white police officer pistol whipped a Black man, and in protest, Black Versailles residents gathered on Rose Hill before setting up armed roadblocks on routes in and out of town. Fires were also set on the land of several white landowners, including the grain stacks of the offending policemen. And I should add that this certainly added on to the fears, a common fear of a Black revolt in which Black people would burn down the town. Arson was a big boogeyman for white conservatives of the time. A militia county in Midway was sent to put down this reported rebellion. Panicked white people in the area reported that they were planning some sort of depredations. And it's likely that this militia company was behind the mob of around 15 to 20 people that went to the homes of William Turpin and James Parker who were Black Republican political leaders in the area and the alleged leaders of the demonstration, and lynched them at their homes. Turpin was a veteran and a Methodist pastor who led a congregation and lived on Clifton Road. His military experience took him through Camp Nelson, and it seems also from the census and from the records of Black soldiers that James Parker had also been through Camp Nelson as a soldier. Rumor was that Turpin led military drills at his church, and these sorts of drilling activities were quite common at the time. These tactics were replicated in 1871 in Danville, where white people in the town reported frantically that Black people had taken, quote, formal military possession of the town. A man named Tom Jones was arrested for arson, and there was a rumor that the Klan was going to abduct him from the jail in Danville, circled in yellow, and lynch him. So about 300 people blockaded the roads in and out of town and gathered around the jail to protect Tom Jones. Reports in the press claim that shots were fired throughout the night, but no one was seriously injured. It seems that these were warning shots or shots in celebration, and Tom Jones was not lynched. So, some takeaways from this resistance after the 15th Amendment. First of all, we can also see the political consciousness building. After the 15th Amendment, Black men were very prepared to organize at the polls, knowing that this would probably involve some sort of an armed struggle. There were also nodes of local leadership, people like Henry Washington and Turpin, who usually organized around the local church and in the local schoolhouse. And these areas were frequent targets of attack. And these nodes of local leadership were exterminated. Henry Washington, Turpin, and Parker. In Fayette County, there is an incident in 1872 when an entire family is lynched near the border of Jessamine County because the head of that family was organizing Black voters. In Woodford and surrounding counties, the building of Black political power was complicated by outmigration. Woodford was a majority Black county, but that was quickly changing. By 1870, over 30% of the Black population had already left, and this trend was exacerbated by racial violence. And in Woodford County, all of the leaders of the Republican Party were purged from the area. They fled immediately after this incident that we just talked about. These incidents of martial manhood show the importance of demonstrating oneself in a martial way at the polls. These were contested sites. They had been contested sites even during the antebellum era. Voting in American history before the Civil War was also often a martial thing. Militias would often march on polling places, for instance, even before the Civil War. And so it makes sense that white Kentuckians feared that opening up voting to Black men would end the monopoly of force, of the use of force that white men saw themselves as having. That now Black men would be participating in these shows of force that were so common around election time and at polling places. And after the 15th Amendment passes, we see white men provoking election violence in the years after the 15th Amendment. But importantly, Black men were prepared to back their claims. And then collective resistance and military tactics. The use of drums for coordinated responses demonstrate the military influence in these instances of armed resistance. After the 15th Amendment passed, it seems that Black Kentuckians were willing to take more radical steps to claim the citizenship entitled to them. In fact, the white press noted often that these were the fruits of the 15th Amendment, as they would say, that the 15th Amendment was responsible for these spates of violence, obviously using this as an example of why the 15th Amendment was bad. But because of the white prerogative to prevent Black people from voting, it seems obvious that this sort of violence would happen, and Black men were prepared for it. Now we move on to the responses to the Klan. So we'll talk about a raid in Watkinsville, and we will talk about a man named Elijah Mars at the very end. But first, starting out here in Scott County, circle here is Stamping Ground, and at the very edge of that circle is a tiny little black hamlet known as Watkinsville. Around that time, only 5 families lived there. But in 1871, a caravan of Klansmen from Henry, Shelby, and Owen counties, the stronghold of Klan activity during this time, went on a rampage on the road from Stamping Ground down to Watkinsville. There was a burgeoning black community all along this turnpike that was evidently being targeted. But by the time that they got to Watkinsville, the inhabitants of the black hamlet there were prepared, and they shot back at the Klansmen, killing one of them. They later unmasked that Klansman and revealed him to be a school teacher from Henry County. It seems that at least 2 of the defenders from Watkinsville were killed by the Klansmen in the shootout, and the press also highlights that those wounded in the attack went to be cared for by the community, likely by black women in the community. So we can see this path over to Stamping Ground that the Klansmen took. They traveled a long way in their journey to this black hamlet in this area where a black community had gathered. And as a response, around 300 families fled this area in Scott County, mostly going to Frankfort. We could see the impact of migration on kind of forcing a crisis among white landowners who responded with a statement condemning the raid since they were losing labor to work their land. But it was too little too late. Up in Monterey, U.S. Deputy Marshal Willis Russell was working at a shop and where Klansmen would often buy material for their masks and gowns. So he had a firsthand account of a lot of Klan activities and Klan plans being formulated and things that they were saying. He himself would be assassinated by the Klan in 1875. But after this raid on Watkinsville, he noted that in Monterey, there was a frenzied discussion about this raid. Some people were agreeing with the raid. Some people were agreeing with the himself, with the self-defense, said that it would have been all right if they had killed all the Klansmen, even though he was a, a Confederate veteran, and he said that he gained their enmity. So there was often a chilling effect on people talking about these instances of white resistance regulators in the southern rim of the bluegrass, where people were afraid to talk about the resistance. A lot of the migrants from Stamping Ground went on to Frankfort, which had its own problems with white violence. The press actually lamented that people within sight of the state capitol were at risk of being attacked by white terrorists. So a delegation of prominent black citizens of Frankfort, including Henry Mars, collected a document recording 116 different incidents of white violence from 1869 to 1871. We can see some examples we've already mentioned here. Here's a map that I've made of the different examples mentioned in this petition. Meanwhile, Henry Mars's brother, Elijah, was traveling throughout the northwestern rim of the bluegrass as a preacher, and he experienced a lot of the wrath of white violence in this area, starting out in Shelbyville when he was a soldier. He actually was a soldier who went through Camp Nelson as well. But then in Simpsonville, we can see his account of the Klan riding into town, some of them mounted on horses, some on mules, with tin horns, old tin pans, drums, bells, making a terrible din. And he responded by arming himself with a pistol. Up in LaGrange, he was the secretary of the LaGrange Loyal League, which was formed by W.L. Yancey. In one incident, he recalled he was over staying at someone else's house when a Klan raid broke out. They broke into the house he was at. There was a frantic reach for the guns in the house among the black people there. The first person to reach for the gun was a black woman, which I think is important to point out because it kind of breaks down our conception of martial manhood. And eventually the Klan retreats. They retreat two different times, actually. One in which Mars and his party did not have any ammo, and another time when they came back and Mars did have ammo and shot back. Then up in Newcastle in Henry County, where the Klan was active and black people could not safely leave town limits, Mars formed the Loyal League, a local branch of the Loyal League after being confronted by Klansmen. So, takeaways again here, political consciousness. One of the tools in the toolkit of Black resistance was calling conventions of local delegates from across the state, for instance, calling for the right to vote. In this case in Frankfurt, they're calling out the level of violence, asking for federal intervention in order to protect Black people. And they kept a valuable record of incidents. Meanwhile, we have highly political Loyal League chapters that organized in self-defense, drilled, and prepared for raids. Some of these incidents covered here actually show the limits of martial manhood and how much the other tactics beyond armed resistance and tactics that weren't coordinated by black men, or at least primarily or solely led by black men, were important. For instance, in Watkinsville, we see community care being enacted by black women, or in LaGrange, when a black woman reaches for the gun. And then finally, we see collective resistance and military tactics once again. And in this case, tactics that aren't necessarily armed resistance, but include outmigration and convention building. So I want to take us to our conclusion. And first of all, here is a list of people who went through Camp Nelson that we've talked about, just to highlight its importance. But I just want to highlight that the Civil War crystallized the growth of Black Kentuckians as a political class. The armed resistance was not always the most practical form of resistance, but it had a solid basis in the ability to claim citizenship on a tested grounds. And armed resistance was often collective, organized, and proactive, with military tactics and rituals incorporated. And just some subheadings, armed resistance becomes more sophisticated immediately after the 15th Amendment, and discussion of these acts of armed resistance were silenced. And we can see the effect of this white violence today. I don't want to demonstrate the resistance of black violence as something that gained an overwhelming victory. It certainly did not, but neither was it futile. And we can see the legacy living on in Kentucky today, with the massive loss of black population in Kentucky being one example. Woodford County, my hometown, has gone from majority black to 5% black. And so that is my presentation. Thank you all for letting me present this. And I'm free to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Micah, for the wonderful presentation. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. And then I know that we did have a winner for the trivia. So Heather, do you want to go ahead and read that question again and announce our winner, please?
So the question was, this formerly majority black town once had the highest proportion of African American residents in Kentucky. Name the town. And that answer was Versailles, and our winner was Dave Polly. So congrats, Dave.
Wonderful. And I know that I did see a question from Maureen
Yes.
in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask him that?
Yes. So she asked, when black men enlisted in the army, were they and their families immediately considered free men? Is that why they were harassed trying to enlist?
So I guess to start off that question, I'll go back to Kentucky before 1864 when Black enlistment was actually sanctioned by the government. By the time in 1864 that Black Kentuckians specifically could enlist, once they had gone beyond Union lines and had enlisted, they would be considered free. But before then, things were more in flux. It took a considerable amount of pushing on the federal uh, to the federal government in order to get Black people who fled beyond Union lines to be considered free. Lincoln budged a lot from this position. And so by the time that in Kentucky this was happening, yes, they would be considered free when they enlisted. But even before then, enslaved people in Kentucky were fleeing to neighboring Tennessee, for example, to enlist in military service. So actually, our numbers on the amount of Black troops who enlisted in Kentucky is probably an undercount because so many people would have just gone to Tennessee before they were allowed to in Kentucky. And at that point, their status would have been more in flux. Um, but really, because Kentucky's unique circumstances of Black troops not being allowed to enlist before 1864, and because slavery was still in place even during that time period, while it was not behind Union lines in the rest of the South, contributed to the explosion of Black volunteers that we saw in Kentucky.
All right. And we had a question specifically about how you wrote things on your slides. So someone asked that your written commentary appears to refer to Black people with a capital B, but white people with a lowercase w, and they were asking if that it was intentional and why.
That is intentional, and I'll tell you what. Um, when I started researching Black history, I initially did not capitalize the B because I thought, well, if I capitalize the B, I have to capitalize the W too, right? But it's actually the editorial standards of a lot of different places to capitalize the B and not capitalize the white, the W in white. Um, so I know it's a little bit bizarre, but those are the standards that it's very common in journalism and academic writing too. But really, you can capitalize it or not capitalize it. It's just up to what different editorial standard you use. So yeah.
We had another question asking, was there a substantial number of free Black people before the Civil War? And if so, were they just lumped into the conflict between white and Black?
That's a good question. In Kentucky, there was not a substantial amount of free Black people. I know there was definitely a small amount, and I'm not very well versed in the history of free Black people in Kentucky, but it was a very small amount. And much before the Civil War, throughout the South, free Black people, as opposed to enslaved Black people, were restricted on a lot of different accounts way before the Civil War and the antebellum era. So there likely was more free Black people in the decades before, immediately preceding the Civil War. But states throughout the South passed a litany of laws that, forbid free Black people from migrating into other states or just all around reduce their rights or put them at risk of being put back into slavery, or for most of them who were born free, being put into slavery for the first time. So I'm not super well versed on that in Kentucky specifically, but that is the broader trend around the South, where the number of freed Black people was reduced a lot by the time of the Civil War.
Right. And that is all the questions we have at the moment.
I do want to add that we had a comment that it was an excellent presentation and you did a nice job.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Yes, someone said they enjoyed your presentation. Thank you it was very well prepared. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about the research that went into this. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what kind of research you did?
Right. This this sort of project has been going on for me for a while now. It started out because I'm from Versailles, and when I learned that Versailles used to be majority Black, um, that's very different from the Versailles that I've grown up in, which is overwhelmingly white. Um, I think the county is around 5% Black, and not many people in the county know the history of Woodford County as a majority Black space. And so I was curious as to why that level of outmigration had occurred. And obviously, there's an economic extent to that, but I've concluded that a lot of that is exacerbated because of racial violence. So I started out with a lot in Versailles. I often go to the Woodford County Library, looking through the Woodford Weekly on microfilm, and then kind of expanded out around that. But I've been interested in racial violence broadly as a topic for a while, and how what this can tell us about white supremacy in the United States and in the South. And I've been interested in how resistance formed against this. So for a while, I didn't utilize, those three foundations I kept going back to of political consciousness and martial manhood. But a lot of research on the Reconstruction era delves into martial manhood. It delves into these different aspects of Black political life, and I think that's important to consider when talking about Black resistance. Um, and a lot of Reconstruction scholars, unfortunately, up until very recently, have underplayed uh, the extent of Black resistance and organization, or even if they talk about resistance, it's talked about in individualistic terms. It's talked about in terms of it was, noble but futile, and not leaving it a definitive mark. And I wanted to change that. So I kept delving into the area around which I've always grown up, and which has a particularly unique history around the Civil War era. And yeah, it's just gone on from then. This has been a part of my master's program research, but it's also been a part of my research as a Woodford Countyan and as someone who is trying to further racial reconciliation in my county.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We do have a few promotional things that we'd like to tell you about that are going on at the museum. So let's go ahead and get those pulled up, and we will go through those. Um, as you probably already know, we're getting closer and closer to our 75th anniversary, which is on July 5th. But our celebration has already started because the museum has a museum-wide exhibition, The Legacy of Behringer-Crawford Museum, 75 Years of Art, Culture, and Community. So each floor of the museum has been transformed to include a lot of the earlier artifacts that were on display when we first opened, such as taxidermy, different fossils. We invite everyone to come and visit and rediscover the museum. Also on display in BCM in partnership with Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame is Northern Kentucky Sports Legends of the 1950s. This exhibit celebrates the athletes, coaches, and teams that helped shape our region's rich sports history. Also on display until August 3rd is Driftwood, The Life of Harlan Hubbard. Inspired by Jessica Whitehead's acclaimed biography, this exhibit explores the life, art, and enduring legacy of one of Kentucky's most beloved artists and thinkers, Harlan Hubbard. Alongside that is also Harlan Hubbard Ripple Effect. That shows Harlan Hubbard's influence on countless writers and artists in our area. The contributors are from our region, Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati, such as essayists, poets, novelists, painters, a songwriter, and photographers. Those are all here, so please come and check all of those out. So our 2025 Music at BCM concert series kicks off this Thursday night with the Turkeys. So it's going to be a great time, perfect for the whole family, for music, fun, and food. We will have available for purchase from Skyline Chili. Hope to see everyone there. The full schedule can be found on our website at bcmuseum.org. But this is also an excellent time to come visit and check out all those wonderful exhibits I just mentioned. So lastly, He's cute, he's cuddly, and he's got a lot to say. Meet Duke, a lovable therapy dog and the star of his own children's book, Duke, the Best Dog in the Whole Wide World. Duke and his co-author, Bill Fowler, will be making a special appearance at Behringer-Crawford Museum on Sunday, June 29th from 2 to 3 for a Chippy's Family Fun Day. Families can meet Duke in person, enjoy a reading from his book, and make a doggone awesome craft. So this event is included with museum admission, but seating is limited. So registration is required by June 22nd, and you can call the museum at 859-491-4003. And our next Northern Kentucky History Hour is going to be on June 17th with Cam Miller. He is going to be presenting How the Stars and Ludlows Brought Back the Reds. So please tune in for that. And if you have an idea for a future program, please email me, Mary Jane, at communications@bcmuseum.org. I would love to hear your ideas. And for more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest Curators Chat, along with all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. Please like and subscribe. That's all we have time for this evening. Thank you again to all of our sponsors and supporters of BCM. Take care, everyone, and until next time, good night.